All right. So as you probably all know, the end-to-end tests, they stand up a whole Octopus server plus tentacles and a database and expose it on a port. So it's like a real live Octopus setup. But for a lot of things, we don't need that much setup, and we can get to something in between a unit test and a full end-to-end test. So about a month ago, we added an in-memory Octopus web server. And so what this does is inside the test process, it stands up the Nancy pipeline and the full end-to-end web server all the way down to the database. It uses the integration test database, the fixture with the relational store. So that was something we've always had for quite a while, which is a integration test database, essentially. Anyway, so it stands up the database, and then it's for each test, it starts a whole new Nancy pipeline. And you can call that pipeline as if it was an external web server, except that the whole thing happens inside the process, which means that the startup time is really quick, and also the request latency is really, really low. So once the initial database is built and set up, each test takes milliseconds to run. So where you would use this is anytime you're testing the API and not the actual deployment process. So say you're testing permissions, which there's some people doing at the moment, or you're just testing some validation on an API, or you just want to verify that the API actually hasn't changed. So in this case, I'm testing to make sure that the website and app pool names can contain variables, which was a bug we ran into recently. So we created an in-memory Octopus server, and we have to just give it the connection string to the underlying database that we created in our fixture. At the moment, it doesn't tear down that database and recreate it each time, but in the future, we can add some logic to kind of back up the database at the start and then restore it to a blank state at the end of the test. So each test is isolated. And at the moment, just be aware that it treads on each other's toes. So if you run into that as a problem, please fix it up by making them isolated. Right? I'm pretty sure there's already methods on it to fix it up. Anyway, so what I've actually just done today is actually hook the Octopus client up to the in-memory Octopus web server. So I've implemented Octopus client against the web server's API because it's a raw kind of Nancy context you get back. So just had to wrap that up for that. So it's in a bit of an intermediate stage where there's still the old kind of way of doing things, which was, I'll show you that, which was create a resource and then pass it to this create function, which then did a raw HTTP kind of, not a raw, but did all the serialization, did the request itself and so forth. Whereas now you can just use the repository, go server.repository, which is a iOctopus repository we're all familiar with, to get the things and interact with them. So here I'm creating a deployment process, loading it using the editor functionality built into the client, adding a step, adding a role, and adding an action to that step. All this here is, that looks like a lot of work, but it's just because since I just converted, I haven't had a chance to go to add step, and there's some helpers like add or update package action. So we just need to add or update an IIS action, for example. Anyway, and then I just make sure that, I can call the API and with a modifier of that process, and it should just return the value because no error bubbled up through the whole thing. So that's pretty much it. A couple of special things we do with it. We also get the opportunity to stub out certain things in the server. So that's another difference to end-to-end tests. So say you wanted to stub out actual server calls to external services, you can do that. So if you say you needed a response from a S3 bucket or from a Azure Web Service, you can stub out that particular service just for your test at that time. So we've stubbed out certain things around the configuration of the server and the authentication. So by default, it bypasses all authentication just to make your tests easier. But obviously, if you're testing with permissions, you want to run in context of a certain user. So you can do that. So there's a flag for that. So yeah, you can modify the container before the web server container is built. So yeah, you can start doing a bit more stubbing, or you can even do post-condition checks to make sure something was called. Get really deep into it. So these are more black white box tests and black box testing, but the big chunk of the server, which is the difference to unit tests. Yeah, that's it. Any questions?
So the big advantage here is just the speed of the test versus the API test?
Yes.
Way faster.
Way faster. So if anybody's run, say, the Swagger test in the end-to-end test back then, that takes, 2-3 minutes to run because it's got to set up all the server. Whereas now these tests, where's my unit test? Took 10 seconds end-to-end. Yeah, and that's the first one takes 10 seconds, the other ones take milliseconds.
And what are we trading off for that speed? What do we lose versus a real API test?
You lose the actual socket stuff. So making a connection to the actual server. So it's not 100% real, but just trust that works.
Yeah, that's okay.
You might have answered this, but how does that work with the tentacle? Do you set up in-memory tentacle? Or what's
no, so you can't, at the moment, it's only API. That's it. Yep. The server doesn't start. I've overridden the start of the server to only start the API. It doesn't start the scheduler, it doesn't start the task queue, it doesn't start any of that. But there's no reason we can't run up a in-process tentacle and get that communication working, or we can, although I'd suggest end-to-end test is better for that, because then you get the actual TCP communication, Halibut communication, which is important. Here we're really just targeting, does the API persist things to the database as we expect it, and can we retrieve things as expected?
Really, really good for permissiony stuff.
Yeah.
Just because of the speed, because you can test a whole bunch of different permission configurations rather than going, each one's going to wait a minute.
It's crazy that it's that much faster. I wouldn't have thought that much of the time was in going across the network stack for something that's running on the same machine.
I find the setup, just setting up, like whenever I run the API, the end-to-end test now, it takes about 1.5 minutes just to set up before it starts running anything.
Yeah, it's because it restarts the server like 4 or 5 times. It starts up, it runs command lines, parses the command line, sits there waiting for the server to spin up, like polling it, going, are you started yet? Are you started yet? Mm-hmm. We've also stripped out a lot of the startup time around task queue and some of that. So
it wastes time when all the startups checking the database schema every time you try and start the server and stuff like that. Whereas the in-memory one presumably doesn't worry about any of that.
Probably does, but it's already upgraded.
And there's all those transient resources we have between the API test that need to be torn down and recreated every time.
Yep. And you can run it from your unit test console. So that's nice. So, and you can see it also outputs the actual startup stuff for you. So here's the actual server log saying that these 2 things actually got hit. The server's recording that. Okay, the request took a little bit longer for whatever reason, probably because they're the first ones. And then, yeah. So what did you want to see, Nick?
If you jump to team invites, restrict something like that, the integration test.
It has to do with
that one? Yep.
Yeah, so here's what a new here's what a new permission test looks like in this. It's got a little bit more helper methods, but it really just gets down to the point of log in as an admin, set up the permissions you want, and then switch to someone that's got that, and then do your test and do your assert. So this takes this takes maybe 1 or 2 more seconds because it actually does set up some of the authentication stuff, but it's still, this will run in 12 seconds versus the minute and a half. Yeah.
The alternative as well you could do is insert stuff in the database directly. The in-memory Octopus server exposes the container that the server runs, so you could resolve the relational store and then run a transaction directly against the underlying database to insert data into it.
Yeah, and so that's what that setup admin stuff does, because this one doesn't have any of the default administrator stuff, so that first call admin setup will go and set up the built-in roles. And just commit straight in. So if you think you need a better helper method here to set up something that's going to be reused, otherwise the admin ones are there, and then the rest is just configure a team based on permissions and call the API.
If you're testing to make sure that the API doesn't regress, like from a point, you shouldn't use the client. You should just send raw JSON. Like have a JSON document, make sure this JSON document still works with the result, because the client will get updated with the new fixes. But if you're trying to do a regression test, that defeats the point.
So what if I wanted to run it up and run off their sequence?
No, because it doesn't expose a public port. It's not open on a port. That's another reason it's quicker. It doesn't need to do that binding.
What if we did that and then all our API tests could run against it?
We need to run some API tests through real network.
Yeah, the orchestration is harder to do in this because there's so much going on. Yeah. And I think it's the orchestration part of the end-to-end tests that take a long time to set up. Right? And you want a real Octopus server running, that sort of thing. So
given now we've got Octopus tests, we've got Octopus integration tests, API tests, and this in-memory tests as part of integration, how would you categorize? I'm about to run a new test. When should I do one or the other?
So if you're testing an API endpoint, I would use the InMemoryWebServer.
So I don't care about the deployment itself, it's just the API.
Yeah, so permissions, you're making sure something persists, you're checking validation, something like that. End-to-end tests are about orchestration. So you want to make sure a deployment occurs. You want to make sure that a task runs. You want to make sure a tentacle deployment looks the right way. Then unit tests are kind of a smaller, self-contained thing. Yeah.
I'm trying to make it clear for people coming on or adding new tests that they know when and where.
Yes.
So I'll be removing the permission ones from the E2E ones to speed that up as I migrate more of them. So you go to E2E and you won't see tests like that in that example.
And if it feels like it's just these API ones.
Yeah.
And that way we're not wasting time running.
So it's still early days, kind of. Nick's particularly dove into it, and we'll see how it looks at the end and whether it does meet all the criteria. But I see, I can see a big benefit over the time taken to send up end-to-ends.
Just being able to run from the unit test console. Wondering if you did this variable evaluation stuff I was doing. So nice to just be able to use.
Tell me you can step into it.
So backing
yes. You can step into the server.
That was painful.
Yes.
Attach the other process.
Yep. Because it is in process.
Yeah, seeing if it falls over if you're debugging a unit test and it throws in the server, then it just breaks right there because it's all in process. Nice.
Yeah,
that's good. It's interesting to see how much we could bring into being like in memory.
Yeah. So I don't think we've had any edge case where we have statics in the server, which may cause some problems, but because we create the container and tear the whole container down for the server. So it should be isolated, except for where we do some caching and statics. If we use single instance stuff in AutoFac, should be okay.
So when I saw that it's called in-memory, I assumed that meant it was an in-memory database. Is that something we could do, and would that give us more of a performance improvement?
It didn't make the isolation easier. I don't look forward to making it like SQL. You mean SQLite or something?
Well, I don't know what there is already. I know that .NET, like EF Core, has got an in-memory version that just works out.
Yeah.
It's something when you're testing though, if you cut too much out, then
In this case, if we do say it's the API purely, then you're going, well, that's fine because I know I'm going to test the database in my end-to-end, etc.
Yeah, but you want to test queries, for example,
And
filtering
matching
queries.
Again, it depends on what we're testing. If we're testing, if like what you're saying, it's purely about API, then to me the database isn't really part of that API.
Oh,
It's definitely
I think it's
API.
part of the API. Yeah.
Is it?
absolutely.
Any more so than some of the other bits we're leaving out?
Well, then it's really more a unit test. If you're stubbing out.
Well, it's still integration because you're putting pieces together and then testing that they all work together.
API can't work without a database behind it.
No,
Yeah,
there
obviously.
is a way you can run up a SQL in memory based on the connections.
Yeah.
It really does
Based
do
on a file, the amount of file.
Yes, yeah, but that's not in memory. That's still a.
It may give us a way of isolating by just copy the file and just start up.
Yep.
Throw away, copy the next. Like,
Yep.
checkpoint and isolate more easily without having to do backup and restore.
Yeah, although backup and restore is really quick anyway.
How long does the start with this take with the database? Maybe it's not so
10 seconds.
It's pretty fast, and you can go in, you can have your SQL window open and check what your data looks like as well when you're writing the test. I've done that and stuff before, especially if you're setting up some new stuff if there's not existing tests.
So most of the setup time is the running of migrations. So if we then snapshot the database before we run the first test, and after each test we just hit a rollback, it should be much quicker. So I think database resources don't take very long, or even snapshots.
It's very
So if
cool.
I can convince everybody in, install the data in the what is called the developer version of SQL instead of SQL Express, I think we can use checkpoints.
We've also got in the integration test area, we've got like an in-memory database or mock databases or mock repositories or things like that flying around, don't we?
Yes.
We've got a lot of different categories with a lot of different lines drawn around the place. Just trying to make sure even though they're all like individually, all these are really good. It's just to make sure we don't get too confused as to what we use.
A good point. Maybe I should call it in process Octopus WebServer.
Yeah, I was going to put a vote in for that.
Cool. Anyway, that's